what the state of AI is now. And also goes into the history of how artificial intelligence was derived from like a system, a basic system of interconnected nodes, like perceptrons, if you've ever heard of that. These are some of the neurotech related labs on campus that I could think of off the top of my head. The Ackman lab in the neuroscience department maps brain circuit structure and experiments with that a little bit, pretty cool. Samaha lab is cognitive neuroscience. It does psychophysics, computational modeling, not so much on the brain-computer interface part, but more just EEG data and processing. Still pretty interesting. The computational and experimental cognition lab, run by Alan Kawamoto, also in the Cog Sci department, is dynamics of cognitive processing using computational experimental approaches, which is kind of a lot of stuff. But cool lab. And also Brain Engineers, which is comparative genomics, AI / machine learning, and neural circuit experimentation. They do a wide variety of stuff, and this lab is actually under David Hausler, who is the head of the UCSC Genomics Institute and the guy behind the Human Genome Project.
Also, wait, real quick, there's also the Applied Machine Learning Lab by Narvi Maruzi, who, like over there, they do a lot of neurotech stuff, EEG stuff. It's sort of more generic, like computational cognitive science. Like they have a lot of psychology and emotion type analysis. But yeah, a lot of what they do is also neurotech related.
Yeah, that's true. And she teaches CS 140 as well, artificial intelligence. Seems like a good class. All right, so just to jump into like the basics of coding for neurotech, most of it is on Python. So if you're not familiar with it, Python is a pretty syntax light, pretty, not too complicated looking programming language with a lot of applicability. People really like the fact that it's not as difficult to parse as things like C or Java, but it still has a lot of the same uses. So people built like a huge variety of libraries that makes Python good for almost anything that you can think of. But specifically for our uses, it's very good for signal processing and data analysis like EEG, and also building machine learning models that, like we're doing for our project, that can accurately transform the data into usable stuff. And fun fact, the name Python is actually from Monty Python, if you guys know what that is, hopefully. So a quick example, just in case nobody here is particularly familiar with Python, I'm just going to run through it. A lot of the differences between Python and other languages is that it uses a lot fewer keywords, and it also uses fewer symbols like brackets or parentheses or semicolons. So it becomes a lot more human readable. So this is just like a simple loop. It's like, while true, just print, this message, no semicolons, no extra arguments like you would have in C, a lot of that stuff, It also has instant variable declaration. You can just write down a word and then have it equal something, and that Python will automatically make that a variable that isn't directly typeset. So it doesn't necessarily need to be an integer or a character or whatever. It's just going to be a variable that holds something. So if that value equals X, then break the program, else print the welcome to whatever. So as you can see, it's pretty basic in this form at least, and it's very human readable. So people really like that, and it makes, even if you're not super familiar with coding in general, you can at least give a pretty good shot at figuring out what you think it means. All right, but if you are unfamiliar with Python, don't worry about it. Neurotechnology has like a lot of different aspects, and you don't need to code to get some really interesting stuff done with it. And if you want to learn more, we will be hosting workshops so that you can just get the fundamentals about it. And yeah, just if you know like a little bit about it, even if you're more on the biology side or the cog sci side, or whatever, it's helpful just to understand the entire data flow and the pathway of how like our project, for example, works, and just neurotechnology in general. So here's some useful tools for constructing Python environment. Current Python is Python 3.8. Anaconda is like a package of Python plus another language called R, data science and scientific computing libraries. It basically just gives you a ton of different libraries and packages and dependencies installed. Once you download Anaconda, it has its own nice little launcher and everything, so it's nice. Google Colab / Jupyter Notebook are, it's basically like Google Docs, but for coding. So multiple people can work on the same thing. Also, another neat thing is that you can run code in little cells, like little self-contained units, so that you're not having to compile the entire thing every time, and you're not having to make sure that the entire thing is working. You can test like little bits at a time, so that's pretty cool. GitHub, that's a classic. If you guys don't know what that is, it's basically version control. So it's like you upload your code to the server, and then every time you make significant process, basically you upload it and you can download it from there, from wherever. And yeah, we'll get into this a little bit later, but it's very useful. It's pretty much it's important for pretty much any coding you could possibly do. Processing is a Python IDE, which I don't have too much experience with myself, but I know it's being taught in CSE 20 and CSE 30 currently. It's a pretty basic Python IDE that is based on like graphical display. So if you don't know anything about programming, but you want to learn a little bit about Python, I would definitely suggest processing, because it's basically meant for visual arts people or non-STEM people to get into coding, because it graphically displays everything that's happening. So it makes it a lot easier to understand than having to like read every individual line and try to figure it out from there. It is also incidentally useful for displaying like spectrograms and stuff. So displaying like high dimensional data it's actually pretty good for that. Text editors in general, things like Sublime or Notepad++, they're great in my opinion. You can't actually run your programs from there, but it's a lot nicer to type in than something like Vim. So yeah, you basically just write your code in there and then copy paste it into whatever environment you'll be using, and then you can have the IDE actually do its work. Also another one, PyCharm. This is my preferred IDE for Python work. Depending on the situation, you end up having to use different IDEs for different purposes, but PyCharm is pretty general. It's by a company called JetBrains, I think, and you can get a free year of the like pro version by just having the UCSC email, which is very helpful. But even if you don't want to do that, the free account like works just fine. It's really nice. It's got tons of bells and whistles, but it's not too complicated to figure out. So I would heavily recommend this one. And just a quick note on virtual environments. Virtual environments are basically like installations of Python that you have on a little partition of your computer with little packages that are specific to whatever you're working on. And you generally install those by yourself using tools like pip, pip install or whatever, and venv. I'm not a big fan of these, but they can be useful depending on what you need to be doing with them. And this is just Git. So I'm not going to go over all of this because if you're not familiar with it, it won't make any sense. And if you are familiar with it, then you know it already. But basically, it's just the flowchart for what you want to be doing in terms of updating and version controlling your code. So the basic idea of Git is that you have a repository of code. And a repo or a repository is basically just a folder where all of your stuff is kept. So you'll create it and then you'll clone it from Git itself to your machine. And then you'll do all your programming, whatever, and you'll add files, remove files, do whatever. And then after you add it, you will commit the changes to Git. And so what that'll do is it'll basically tell Git like, hey, I have a new change. And then you'll give a little message. So that part's really useful. You can be like, oh, okay, I fixed this function, but now this is broken, or I did this, but now everything is ruined and I have no idea what to do, which is one of my more frequent commit messages. But after that, you push your files to the server. So what that does is just upload them from your computer to Git, and then once they're on Git, you can access them from anywhere, basically. Branches are another thing. So when you have multiple people working on the same project, especially if they're going to be working on some of the same files, you don't want people messing with each other's files, right? Because if people are uploading and downloading all at the same time and they're all working on different crap, like it becomes really complicated really quickly. So what people generally do is people will create their own little branch. So if you think of Git as like a tree, where the central node, like the root, is a repository, people creating branches is like branches of a tree, right? So they'll have their own version of files that they can work on, and then they can eventually, either merge them back with the trunk, the master branch, or they can just do their own thing. Which I'm running here. So yeah, that's Git. It's pretty much an essential for any job with computer science or coding, and it's also essential for neurotechnology, especially if you're working with multiple people, because otherwise it'll get messed up really fast. So digital signal processing with Python. So we're going to get more into this next week, but I thought just like, a primer slide might be good. So a signal, it's just a measurable quantity that varies with time. That's the essential definition. So non-periodic signals are often visualized with spectrograms, which you've probably heard of before. I think I mentioned earlier. And that's one way that we visualize EEG signals in high-dimensional spectrograms, because they aren't repeating. They're intensely variable. I mean, they are repeating in some ways, but there's a lot of variation. So we need to find a good way to show that. And then you can decompose them and analyze them via Fourier or wavelet transformation. This is like, decently heavy math stuff, but honestly in Python, like you barely even need to understand the math. You can pretty much just plug in an equation. So a lot of the brain data that you get from things like EEG, often in the form of three-dimensional or much higher spectrograms, alpha, beta, and gamma waves. And Python, it's just really good for this. I mean, you can technically do it with almost anything, but in lower level languages, it's going to be a lot harder. You're not going to have the support there, and you'll have to do a lot of the raw coding yourself, whereas Python has a lot of libraries. A lot of people have spent a lot of time trying to figure out ways to make it work in Python. So you can basically just build off their work, and it helps a lot. And I think Rohan will talk a lot more about this next week. So more about Python libraries and support structures. So some of the most important ones are here. OpenBCI, Open Brain Computer Interface, one of the most important ones, especially for neurotechnology. It's got a lot of the functions you need for just interfacing with amplifier boards, interfacing with EEGs, EMGs, and not having to write a lot of the stuff yourself. Matplotlib is useful for neurotechnology as well, and also just very useful for anytime you want to visualize any sort of function or data in nice ways. Like a lot of people use this for scientific papers. You just use Matplotlib and you can configure a graph or whatever you need to accurately show what you're trying to represent. SciPy is very great as well. It's general. A lot of math, a lot of signal processing, data analysis kind of stuff. You'll almost certainly be using at least a few functions from this every time you're doing something with complicated data or science. NumPy is great for like arrays. Basically, as you see here, it'll create like huge like multi-dimensional arrays, and it's got a bunch of functions for very efficiently dealing with that and analyzing it. And Pandas is also great for creating like data frames, basically, which are effectively like big tables that you can edit the rows and columns in and sort data really easily that way. So yeah, those are some of the most important Python libraries for neurotechnology specifically. So a little bit about hardware. Because Python is so popular, even though it's pretty high level and it's not actually that super efficient for like actual hardware stuff, people have figured out ways around that just because they love it so much. So an example of this is MicroPython. which is a variant of Python that's specifically designed to work on microcontrollers and microprocessors. It's not as efficient as something like C. I don't think it's can compile quite as well. But for almost anything, unless you're really in industry, and you want it to be as perfect as possible, MicroPython is great. It's really useful. It's almost every single it has almost every single function of regular Python, except like a couple of data types aren't supported. But it makes things a lot clearer, definitely. I would very much recommend it if you're trying to do like your own type of project, like you want to have, I don't know, a little computer that controls something, you want to make a little small robot or something, but you're not that comfortable with C or lower level languages or just hardware in general. I would definitely recommend something like MicroPython or CircuitPython. Still though, despite everybody working with Python all the time, the king of smaller microcontrollers and things like Raspberry Pi, single use computers is probably Arduino, which uses C and C++, which if you don't know has led, like C and C++ made, like 45 years ago, at least C. And it's, I think it's even older than that actually, but it's basically the founding of like all modern object-oriented languages. And it's definitely harder than Python. It's not impossible by any means. And in fact, in like upper div CS classes, you'll pretty much be using that all the time. But it's definitely less human readable, and it's a lot more kind of arcane. And it doesn't support like a lot of the stuff that Python does. One of the really great things about Python is that it has a lot of libraries, a lot of community support. So if you don't really know how to do something in Python, you can pretty much look up how to do X with Python on the internet, and like guaranteed somebody will have written something for it. Whereas in C and Java and stuff, there are still tons of libraries, but for something ultra specific, you'll probably have to end up writing a lot of the stuff yourself. And all right, so on to brain-computer interface data flow. So EEG signals, just to refresh, are brainwaves. EMG signals are nerve and muscle signals. So there are two main types of electrodes that are used academically and professionally, and they're called wet and dry. Wet electrodes generally consist of like silver chloride material. And you put a gel wherever you're going to put on the person's skin first, and then you place the electrode in that gel, and the gel acts as a conductor that amplifies the necessary signal so that the electrode can pick it up. And they're really, really good. Like that's pretty much what people use most of the time when they're actually trying to get the most accurate brain signals as possible. But I mean, you can't just be placing gel on yourself all the time. Like it's pretty much only useful in laboratory conditions, or when you're trying to get the best, the best possible returns at the expense of convenience and portability and so forth. Dry electrodes are the other variant, and they're usually made out of stainless steel. You just put them straight on. A lot cheaper than silver, and they have more noise. But like, that's what generally people are like leading, like startups and stuff are trying to use dry electrodes for like wearable practical applications, because nobody wants to be putting on gel and like specifically positioning the electrodes and blah, 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 blah. So this is, dry electrodes are the more convenient approach, definitely. And then, so here's a little thing here. So once you get the electrodes, and you place them on the person through a head cap, or just place them wherever or whatever, and you get the data, you generally put it through an amplifier board, and you can most of them, honestly, it's the best to probably buy them somewhere, but it's honestly not even that hard to make one yourself. I did a project in sophomore year under a grad student, and he taught us how to make a basic amplifier board with a bunch of filters on it from just a small tiny little breadboard. It's not there's even DIY tutorials that you can find on the internet, and after all that, it'll cost like $15 and it'll run on a 5-volt battery, so it's really not too hard. But yeah, one of the best libraries after you get the data from an amplifier board is called BrainFlow. And that's from OpenBCI. And that facilitates a lot of the data analysis there. So after you got your signals, you can basically pass it to your computer. And then you analyze that using Python. BrainFlow, MNE, OpenBCI, and a lot of that stuff. And that's where you get spectrogram visualization, and you can start like trying to pick out the parts that you care about, and then eventually pass it to an AI or machine learning model, like right here. And you will need to pre-process the data before AI, the model can get to it. If you have too much noise, then it's basically useless. So if you have enough filters, if your electrodes are good enough, and if you do the correct data mashing techniques, basically, you'll get some good stuff, and you can apply that to machine learning. So we have a couple of slides from Sahil right now, who's the head of the data team. So I'm going to pass it over to him if he'd like to talk about it for a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I'll just put it up.
Can you actually share your screen, or are you not allowed to do that? I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah, it's disabled for me.
Okay, no problem. I'll do that.
Yeah, I can actually turn it on. Cool. How about now?
Yeah. You guys can see.
Do you want to give like a quick intro about like what you're doing and how that stuff works?
Yeah, I'm currently working on the subvocalization project. Basically, as the EMG signals come from the hardware team, we use many tools to actually access those data, to actually access that data and visualize it.
I think some of the people here might wait. Who here is like familiar with like the subvocalization project that Neurotech Club is working on right now? Like raise your hand or just like say something. Yeah, okay. I think we should just like give a quick explanation too, like of like what the project is and like how the overall data flow and stuff works.
Okay. Yeah, basically the hardware team subvocalizes either yes or no. And the siphon board gets the data signals, and the OpenBCI application exports all the data into a text file. We receive a text file, and we basically use many tools to read into that data and visualize it. And then we use many tools to filter that data and standardize it for the ML model.
Yeah. And then like just a brief overview of what subvocalization actually is. Basically, subvocalization is this phenomenon that happens when you read text or like you're thinking to yourself in your mind, where your brain will send these signals to your vocal cords, like subconsciously, that actually sort of pronounce the words without you even trying to pronounce them. So if we put like EMG electrodes around your throat area, we can actually pick up on those signals and basically do what seems like telepathy. So that's what we're working on right now. And I think it's super cool. So data team has like a really important job there because obviously with these EMG electrodes on your throat, people are like moving around. They have like other muscle movements in their neck. So it's important to clean that data before we actually try to predict what the person is saying with a machine learning model. So yeah, so feel free to explain more on how that works.
Yeah, basically, we first, I was going to explain how why pre-processing is important, but
yeah, sure, yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, as the data comes from the site, from the hardware, it needs to get processed because a lot of the raw data contains a lot of the unnecessary stuff, such as it often contains a lot of noise and high frequency spikes or other brainwave measurements that we don't want in our data specifically for your reasoning. So the pre-processing step is aimed at actually trying to reduce this unnecessary data as much as possible and scale it down for the ML model for better predictivity. Basically, I said it again. I mean, I said it. On the right is like, you can see like a plot of like 7 channels of the EMG data. The hardware team, the OpenBCI application, what it does is that once the hardware team records their data, it exports all that data into a text file. We receive that text file and we use many tools to basically read into all that data and visualize it. And I'll talk a bit more about M&E on the next slide. Basically, there are many data processing techniques, too many to cover in just one slide. Our current pipeline uses a forced-order low-pass Butterworth filter to approximate this data, and we standardize it to scale it down. We use M&E tools to implement the filter, and M&E is like an open-source Python package for exploring and analyzing human neurophysiological data. So it has a lot of processing techniques, basically, but we only use it for our filtering purposes. And you can see on your right side how after filtering the data, it sort of approximates all the variations. And you can actually see it in one smooth line compared to the graph right over here. And doesn't necessarily take out all the huge spikes. And we standardize the data using scikit. Now, scikit is a Python library built on NumPy, SciPy, and Matplotlib, and it's used for predictive data analysis. Brief explanation of standardization is basically scaling all the values down based on the mean. So the mean value will be scaled down to 0, and every other value will be scaled down to how many standard deviations it's away from the mean. So yeah, that's how we're processing the data currently in our subvocalization project.
Cool. Yeah, any questions about how that project works and all of that? Nice. Okay. Yeah, Cameron, go ahead.
Great. All right. So
Do you want me to start sharing the screen or?
yeah, sure. That'd be great. Thanks. Let me. So last thing is just going to be a poll here. I'll copy this and then put it into the Zoom chat. It's basically just a poll about programming experience, which we're also going to put in the general chat. So right there, appreciate if everybody could fill it out real fast. And then, yeah, any questions about Python, coding for Neurotech, the project, or anything? You can like unmute your mic and ask or put something in chat or whatever.
Cool. Okay, I think
Great.
yeah, that's great. I'm gonna stop the recording.